Hi, welcome to episode 22 of Seize the Moment podcast, and today we're going to talk about the several factors sustaining mental health. And actually, we read this article on Vox recently. It was very interesting about the different sorts of treatments that are used for treating depression. One thing that was really interesting about this article that I liked was that they talked about not how ineffective medication can be, but how there are other factors that have to deal with treating depression, and how medication is not always the most effective way.
Yeah.
And I don't know, what did you get from the article when you read it?
Well, so the author of the article, his name is Johan Hari, and so I think he's a writer/journalist who went on this kind of journey, and I don't know how long he went on it for, but I think he said 3 years, something like that. So he went on this 3-year-long journey, right, sort of seeking out the causes of mental illness. And so interestingly enough, he pretty much found what a lot of us, if not all of us, find as therapists. So when we go to school, right, we kind of learn about first the medical model of psychology or psychiatry. That, you have this obviously brain, right, this sort of important organ that pretty much is or can be kind of encompass or could encompass who you are as a person, right? And there's some sort of let's say defect in it or something wrong, some malfunction in it that obviously causes you to kind of feel sad or really anxious, right, or really angry, whatever it is, right? Sort of it makes you feel these emotions to the extreme. So the medical model teaches us essentially that it's really your brain, right? There's something wrong with it, so you got to go see the doctor. The doctor will say, you got a chemical imbalance. Here's this pill. Come back next month and let me know how you feel. So what I took away from the article is pretty much the same thing that I took away when I kind of was a graduate student. That essentially it's a very sort of myopic view of mental health or mental illness, that it doesn't really explain the factors fully, right, in terms of what encompasses a person's emotional well-being. So for a person, let's say, who's taking medication, right, that doesn't in itself mean that the medication isn't important. And what I like about the article, what Harvey says, is that essentially the medication is a big help for a lot of people. It's just that unfortunately a lot of times what we do is we kind of try to medicate the problems away. So instead of saying like, okay, let's kind of take a holistic approach and a view of your life, right, let's figure out sort of how do you feel about yourself, right, how do you feel about other people, how do you perceive the world, are you optimistic, are you pessimistic, are you somewhere in the middle? Let's say, kind of, are you struggling with poverty, are you struggling, let's say, in school right now, are you being bullied, like all of these different factors that make up a life. These are the things that maybe not always obviously, but when you come to a psychiatrist's office, they don't really focus on them. They just say, it's a sort of kind of dysfunction of your brain. So what I mainly took away from the article is kind of something that I think that all of us as therapists at least kind of know to some extent, is that there's so many different factors underlying depression or anxiety or anger that you can't just sort of boil it down to a brain chemistry issue, which a lot of people do.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that they spoke about in the article was this, it's called social prescribing, right? So there was this patient who they referenced like as a little clinical scenario of, right? Her name's Linda.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she pretty much, she was seeing a psychiatrist one-to-one, and the psychiatrist wanted to try a new method for treating her depression. He said, hey, I'd like you to attend group counseling sessions. And this actually proved to be very effective, because what ended up happening is that over the course of, and yes, this took a while, but over time, she seemed to show progress. This was over, I believe, a 3-year period. And what ended up happening is they engaged in different activities. I believe one of the central ones that they engaged in was gardening. And this kind of this gave them an activity to do. They all hung out together. They talked to each other and made bonds with each other. And this was very effective for her. It gave her a kind of... how should I say this? It let her be with other people. Right.
I made her feel important, right? Like a part of a community.
Yeah, and then other people who were also going through the same thing, so her problem wasn't so common. It's not that they were experiencing the same things, but she had other people to talk to. Yeah. It wasn't just her and the therapist. And yeah, the people who are around us, our environment, is very important in our mental health, for sure.
You know what the biggest predictor of resilience is? Social support. That's literally it. So one of the questions that I would ask clients on an intake would be like, well, so an intake is kind of the initial evaluation of the person when they come in. It's literally, what is your social support system? Like, who would you list as a social emotional support system, and who do you think that you can turn to in difficult times?
Wow.
So the most important predictor. So the people that find it hard, obviously, to kind of rebound from any particular mental illness are the ones who list like either nobody or like maybe one person who's sort of close.
Wow, so it's not that many people usually.
Yeah, for a lot of them, right? So the thing is, and why this model is so important, and why I think so. Let me just kind of sort of turn back and talk about the model itself, right?
Right. Addressing a person's biological,
Yes.
psychological, and social needs, correct? Or
So close. So yes. Well, so social. So it's threefold, right? So so the medical model says it's purely biological, right? Sort of you have this prediction. You have this what's the word? I guess predilection, right? To sort of feel depressed because of your brain chemistry, right? So
right.
it's like
Serotonin,
dopamine, and dopamine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's it. So the biology is sort of miscombobulated, right? So that's actually true. So the medical model is actually partially true. So the other two factors are the ones that you just mentioned. So they're social, environmental, and then the other part is the psychological. So it's called the biopsychosocial model. So the biopsychosocial model posits that it's sort of your genes, your genetic predisposition toward depression, anxiety, and let's say whatever other ailments. And oh man, just by the way, just as a quick aside, so psychiatry has been looking for the sort of sets of genes, right, that kind of predispose us to these different illnesses. And what they've actually found, which is like so wild, that so you can like find, or they technically have found the genes that predispose you to particular mental health, like let's say troubles or problems. But the problem is that all of them predispose you to different illnesses. So it's like if you have like these kind of this cluster of genes, then you're predisposed to schizophrenia, ADHD, depression, right? So they can't really figure it out, right? Yeah, so it's tough. You can't just say, oh, if you have these genes, right, you'll have depression. So that's why the biological model is such a problem.
Just for 5 seconds,
sure.
I want to just mention this. You've heard of epigenetics, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so even if you had a gene that disposes you to a certain character trait or certain traits,
yep.
How it may express itself based on environmental, social, and like whatever is going on internally, maybe actually, sorry, I'm not qualified to say that part.
Mm-hmm.
I was about to say your diet as well. Who knows? But there's all these little
factors
factors
environmental.
that deal with the expression of that gene, and that's after that's just dealing with the environment as you grow. Mm-hmm. So that's just interesting as well. There's variance,
and the trauma can even be passed down.
Yeah.
Right. So in terms of the biological model, right, it pretty much posits that like you're kind of okay. Let me not say that because it's not true, but it doesn't necessarily say that you're determined to be, let's say, depressed or anxious or whatever, but it does say that it's, well, this random process, and random to the extent that we don't really know how to predict it, right? Some people have disordered brains and other people don't, that we really don't understand why. So the thing is, when it comes to biological models, so it's only partially correct. So with the biopsychosocial model, it always asks not necessarily only what do you feel, or not what do you feel like, but it doesn't only look at your brain chemistry, or only asks like essentially what your symptoms are. That's a better way of putting it. But it also asks what's going on in your environment, right? Do you feel like, let's say you do have these protective factors, right? Like let's say people who care about you, people you can turn to, people whom you feel like accept you and see you as you are, right? And also on top of that, they ask about the psychological factors, right? I always ask my clients, what is your self-esteem, right? From a 0 to a 10, how would you rate it, right? What is your self-efficacy from a 0 to a 10, how would you rate it? So obviously at the lower end of the spectrum, we find that there's a high correlation with depression and anxiety, right? So self-efficacy can be described as your ability, or rather your sense of your ability to master the world. So if your self-efficacy is low, essentially you're going to kind of feel like shit about yourself. And there's usually a correlation, right? So the lower the self-esteem, the way you kind of see yourself as a whole, the lower your self-efficacy, the lower you kind of see yourself as a way of, or as a master of your world. So what we find is that with self-efficacy and self-esteem, right, the psychological, how I see myself, is essentially correlated with these really negative symptoms. Well, they're all negative, I guess, but negative symptoms of, let's say, depression, anxiety, kind of, let's say, these different kind of types of anger disorders, right? And so the biopsychosocial model says, like, what is it that we can do, right, in terms of all of these three factors that can help the person feel better, right? Because often what we find, and what Hari found, is that when you give a person medication, and it's something that we talked about on, like, I think maybe 3-4 shows ago, right?
100%.
So, right. So when you just give a person medication, right, it only does so much. So if somebody has moderate to severe depression, right, for severe, it's actually not that effective. So unfortunately what happens is there's this kind of peak, and then there's this valley, and sort of they pretty much just go back to where they were before. When it comes to moderate depression, it helps them so insofar as it helps them go to therapy, right, to actually deal with these problems where they don't feel debilitated. And I think I mentioned before that when it comes to mild depression, right, it actually doesn't do anything for it. So when we talk about the medication and what the research says is that it's only really moderately effective, and that it's kind of like a means to an end. It's really to get the person to go to therapy to sort of be able to kind of use the tools that they learn, right, critical thinking, the ability to socialize, right, in order to build a life for themselves that will actually get them off of the medication.
And actually, there's something I wanted to cite from the article. I have it here on a PDF on the left here. We were going to print this out, guys, but had a little printer issue before. So I'll just read this verbatim. Steve Lardy, professor of psychology at the University of Kansas, summarizes the research on chemical antidepressants this way. Via email, he said, only about 50% of depressed individuals experienced an initial positive response to antidepressants, and only about 30% achieve full remission. And of all those depressed individuals who take an antidepressant, only a small subset, estimated between 5 and 20%, will experience complete and enduring remission.
Yeah.
In other words, the drugs give some relief and therefore have real value, but for a big majority, they aren't enough.
Right.
And that's why it's important to address these other factors that influence how to treat depression. So this way you have more of a, as Leon put it, a holistic view of how to treat it.
Right, of the person, of the person's psyche. I mean, because here's the thing. My interpretation is that, let's say somebody is on medication, right, and they're still super lonely, right, and they still feel like they haven't been able to achieve anything. So, I mean, I can imagine that for a little bit of time that they'll be like, oh, you know what, I feel happier, right, I did this thing. And by the way, I also think one of the biggest parts that, like, or aspects that make the medication work is the fact that the person really feels like they've done something to help themselves. So it's like this high of, like, I went to the doctor, right, I did what I was supposed to do, so now I kind of feel better because I feel, you know, my self-efficacy maybe went from a 3 to like a 5 or a 6, right? So I think that's definitely a part of it, right? Which is why there's this big peak in the beginning, right? Where you're like, wow, I feel great. So, and after obviously some time, right? I mean, the medication is going to work for whatever period. Obviously, it's different for different people. But the point is, it's like if you don't really actually work toward changing your life and figure out kind of what the barriers are preventing you from having the things that you want or even need, rather, then, I mean, what's going to happen is like what happened with Hari and with these other people, right? There's this sort of peak and then it kind of falls down. So,
you know, I'm going to throw a curveball at you right now.
Shoot.
So, you know who just got admitted into rehab?
Yes, I saw Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Why is that a curveball?
I don't know if you expected that because we were just going to talk about this.
No, I hear you. I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for Klonopin use, because his wife is going through, and this is a very serious thing. She's going through serious cancer, right. And he gave him like tremendous anxiety and all that, and I suppose that was for his anxiety. However, when he tried to get off of it, he had serious physical withdrawal symptoms, right. And he decided, which is I think good judgment, to get himself into rehab. Yeah. It's not like somebody else signed him up for it. So that's cool. I understand that he wrote the book, The 12 Rules of Success, and he was a figure who was like supposed to be this person who has everything handled. Or maybe you can still see that they're human, but to some degree they mostly have everything handled. But then you see a case like this, and that's actually very interesting, at least as far as anyone who read his book. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sorry, what did you want to say?
I'm just technically going to interrupt you. So I was going to say just to be really careful for kind of like the audience, or obviously anybody who's listening. So that class of drugs, the benzodiazepines, those are actually very rarely prescribed. So what he was on, the Klonopin, a lot of, maybe probably like, I don't know, 80% of psychiatrists wouldn't even give that to him. So especially as the initial drug. So what they initially do is give you an SSRI, right? So an SSRI has very limited side effects, if any at all, and it's much easier to get off of. Not to say that there aren't any symptoms of withdrawal. I mean, people kind of feel shitty after getting off of them.
But it's definitely easier.
Yeah, it's not like cocaine withdrawal, or it's not like heroin withdrawal, and it's definitely not like Klonopin withdrawal. So whoever gave him that medication, well, look, let me not, I don't know Jordan Peterson. Maybe somebody tried to give him an SSRI, and he's like, hey, it's really not working, I still feel really anxious, and then they gave him
However, if they didn't, that's
no, especially for somebody without a history of anxiety disorder. So if, let's say, a client were to come in and they were to say, hey, like, all of my life I've had generalized anxiety disorder, and like I've tried, or maybe I didn't even try these medications, but my anxiety is so severe that I can barely even get out of my house, right? I need something strong. So Klonopin, Again, people would hesitate. They would say, I mean, if you... No, they wouldn't. They probably wouldn't even do it. They would say, let's try the SSRI first and then kind of see if it works. And if not... Because the thing is, Klonopin's highly addictive. I'm not surprised. So whoever gave him that, I don't know what their reasoning was, but, I mean, most people would hesitate too. That's all I'm saying. Just with the medications, they're not all in the same class. Because sometimes people say, oh, medications, look at Jordan Peterson. He's addicted, see? No, it doesn't work that way. Most psychiatrists would not automatically say, yeah, let's give him benzodiazepines.
No.
Yeah.
No, I think it's as you said before when you were getting a little more nuance into it. It's possible that they tried SSRIs first and then went to that. Possibly.
Right.
To be fair, we don't know. But,
yeah.
But sorry, yeah.
No, I was going to ask you. So in terms of like kind of symptoms of depression, right? I mean, if you're okay with obviously talking about
Oh, yeah, more than okay.
All right, cool.
I love talking about it.
Because I know, like, for me, right? So that if, let's say from my perspective, and I've never been on any sort of medication, but I know that, like, the times in my life where it hasn't changed, right? Nothing really changed, right? I kind of was in these low moods. I felt like shit about myself. And do you feel like for you it was the same, right? Where it's like if you were kind of in this space, right, that you felt like, let's say you were lonely, then maybe you felt like, I don't know, life isn't where you wanted it to be, right? Do you think that a medication would have been enough for you at that time?
I wouldn't have wanted a medication.
Really? Why?
Honestly, because I wouldn't say I did, I was this researcher and all that, but any articles that I had seen about antidepressants and all that, about people more likely to commit suicide or something like that, or that it's not necessarily targeting the underlying causes of depression, although from a more nuanced perspective.
It is half or no 1/3.
In the sense of like any belief, thought, any underlying like cause like that. I'm not talking about like a chemical imbalance. Like yes, I agree. Yeah, if I was low on serotonin and all of a sudden because I've increased my serotonin, I've freed up enough mental resources to now think differently about my life situation.
By the way, that does happen.
Exactly, which is why I'm fair enough. That's why I'll be nuanced about it. Absolutely, fair enough. But like at least anecdotally from my own personal experience, when I had seen those articles, I had shied away from ever even considering taking an antidepressant. I always wanted to address my any kind of deep-seated neuroses from more of like a psychosocial perspective, like just straight up, just not attacking, more like understanding what are my current thoughts and beliefs. Yeah. What are some thoughts and beliefs maybe that I could adapt that could maybe assist me. Who are the people I'm around, and is it good to be around them? Should I maybe try to be around some other people, have different kinds of influences? Yeah. Is it both? And then I realized it was both, and there were more factors as well. Yeah. So yeah, in my own experience, the things that helped me with depression was definitely having a peer group and people I could talk to. It was also attempting to help myself. I wasn't in such a... So there were times when I was in a low place where I didn't want to do anything, to be fair. Yeah. But for the most part, I did try to seek resources that would help me out, whether it was a book, whether it was some kind of video on YouTube, whether it was like a podcast, whether it was maybe it's something as simple as music, or just having maybe trying to go out and have a good time or something like that. And maybe just I wasn't being social enough. It depends. Like it was never one thing that I needed to have taken care of in order for me to feel happy.
But I wonder, without, let's say, medication, do you think that it was easy, or, I mean, whatever, I mean...
I don't know, because I never tried medication. If you're going to ask...
No, I don't know. Okay, what do you think I was going to ask?
What I thought you were going to ask is, do you think it would have been that it's easier without medication to... No? Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask, so do you think that it was easier or difficult for you to form healthier views of yourself?
It was all difficult.
It was all right. So because that's what I'm wondering. Because for like some of my clients, what it is that the medication actually helps them internalize the things that we talk about. So it's like, whereas initially, right, it's so interesting. So I'm gonna get kind of sciencey on this, right? Because I do think it's important. Okay, so,
don't get sciencey, Leon.
Okay, so no, and then also I'm afraid to, because I don't know that much about it. But so from my understanding of like from his article and from some other things that I've read, is that essentially it's sort of like, okay, so some people argue that it's not a chemical imbalance, right? That there's a different wiring in the brains of people who struggle with depression and those who don't, right? So my interpretation of it is, and I think he even said this in the article, was that essentially when it comes to like dark thoughts, right? So the people, so you know like how we
shedding synapses.
Synaptic pruning, yeah. Mm-hmm. So you know like when we learn something, right? So we learn like a language, whatever it is, right? Obviously we make these neural connections internally. So my wonder is that, so like, oh man, there's so much here. My brain is like all over the place. So like, all right, so I had a client, right? So this client was like, hey, you know, like without the medication, right? I wasn't able to like really kind of, you know, sort of reframe my thinking, right? It just wasn't possible. So from what I understand, you know, just piecing it together with the article, is that like, let's say when it comes to synaptic pruning, right? And you know, you prune away all of the positive things that you've learned, right? So you learned, or rather the positive, whatever you learned. So you prune away kind of the positive beliefs that you have about yourself, and you say, like maybe even prune away the tools that you had of critical thinking, right? It's not there anymore. It's forgotten. So in the article, I think it was, I don't remember the author, not the author, the researcher. Whatever. So he essentially said that it's not so much about chemical imbalances, even though I don't think it's black and white. I obviously do think that there's a chemical imbalance based on other things that I've read. But what he says is that when it comes to synaptic pruning, right, it's easier for us to focus on those dark thoughts, right, because we prune away all of the, this is my interpretation, the good information about ourselves, maybe even the tools of using it. So I wonder, right, so if somebody who's struggling with depression, if maybe they're not able to internalize the positive thoughts, or they're not able to internalize the tools, right, because they're not able to like kind of learn, right? I wonder if it's like, if let's say I'm in the session and I'm teaching this person critical thinking and I'm saying, hey, you know, I know you believe you're a failure, but let's kind of examine that. I wonder if they're able to even internalize what I teach them, which is why the medication is so important. Maybe the medication in a sense somehow allows them to form these new connections and to learn, hence obviously to form these new beliefs. And this is just pure conjecture, I don't know, but I think it's an interesting area.
I think there's something to that. Yeah, because if somebody has been used to thinking very negatively for a long time, I mean, you would argue their brain is then wired to think that way.
Yeah.
Just to make it simple.
No, it's true. Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. So if you're trying any new behavior, that's going to take a while for that to have any sort of momentum and to build new synapses right. And kind of turn the emotional seesaw the other way. Right. It would take a very long time. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've heard research that says that it usually takes 30 days to build a new habit. Mm-hmm. But to be fair, if you spent like not just months, let's say years mm-hmm. in a very depressed sort of state, of course it's going to take a long time to unwire that and to think other things. And it may just be a thing of just having a long-term treatment mm-hmm. and having that build some sort of momentum. Mm-hmm. And I suppose depending on the person, you have to be very careful mm-hmm. with that, especially if they've been thinking negatively for many years. Yeah. But there's definitely. I think we even talked about resistance before. Mm-hmm. Right? Wouldn't you argue that somebody would be resistant to thinking in a optimistic sort of way if they've been deeply entrenched in depression?
Yeah, and my question is why? And that's something I've never really been able to figure out. So, with people who have, more moderate depression, I think it's much easier, right? So, let's say we'll go through the cognitive thought record, right, and the whole kind of critical thinking process, and mostly, not automatically, but, within, let's say, a few sessions, they'll get it. They'll be like, yeah, wow, I can't believe I ever thought this way. This doesn't make any sense. But with some of the more treatment-resistant patients, it's it doesn't work. It's in one ear and out the other. They're like, nope, it just hasn't done anything. And I would kind of question them, right? I would ask, why? What do you think is going on? Because obviously you're thinking irrational. And they would just say, I don't know. That's it, right? And it sort of kind of stops there, and we're both sort of at the standstill. So that's why I was wondering for you, was it easy or difficult for you to reframe your beliefs?
Well, here's the thing. One thing that I've had about me for years, even while I was... I don't know what level of depression I had, by the way, to
Yeah.
be fair. I was never diagnosed, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it was severe.
Right.
Maybe subjectively, I would, at the time of that depression, it's severe, but I don't know. I don't know.
No.
But for me, I always had a thing where I like to think from multiple perspectives. I did like to think, like, what is this person's reason for doing it? Doing whatever they're doing, what is my reason for doing it? How are they interpreting me? How am I interpreting them? How is this leading? Where is this leading, for example? And yeah, so because of that, I was always open to other ways of thinking. It's just that to internalize them and to actually build any sort of momentum to them, that was where the issue lied.
Right.
Because I knew, for example, okay, it was plain as day. Okay, yes, I was depressed, and I was at least to my own interpretation of myself, I was weird socially at a time, a little twitchy, little things like that, little behaviors, very reactive, all that. And even when I read different kinds of sources that talked about being non-reactive, things along the lines of affirmations, what else?
Right, so
meditation, all that.
Yeah.
Like, even when I realized there were all these methods that I could use, even to begin to try to use those methods, or to internalize some of the understandings that might have been espoused in certain books, like, for instance, if, let's say, I was really in my mind thinking about past events, let's say a breakup or something like that, even if I was reading something that said that whatever happened in the past doesn't really have any I mean, technically would have no power now if you were just present to the moment.
Power of Now?
That's one book. That's one book, for example, right? Or whenever you're thinking about now if you're talking about power of now, now if we're going to go there. Yeah, like anytime I'd be thinking of the past, I'm doing it now. Anytime I'm thinking about the future in terms of, like, I'm anxious about something, or I understood that, like, if I was present to the moment, I would not be using my mental resources, like either going backwards or forwards. I would be able to then achieve some modicum of peace, and be able to move forward with my life and do whatever I need to do at that particular point in time. But there were also different perspectives on it too. There was also, like, actually dealing with your past issues, or dealing with your interpretations of the future.
Right, yeah.
Like, it's not just always about being present to the moment. Sometimes you should interpret. You shouldn't just, because here's the thing: if you're constantly going attempting to be present to the moment, and anytime you are successfully doing that, yes, that's a beautiful thing. 100%, it's beautiful. Thing is, if you're not going after the underlying causes of what's creating those thoughts, you can argue that it's almost like you're stuffing down whatever it is that's bothering you every time you're attempting to just no, I'm just going to try to be in the moment. However, that's just one way of thinking about it. Another, I think we said this before, it was something from Buddha, like a quote, where it's like, if someone shoots an arrow at you and the arrow hits you, like, let's say in your arm or something like that, you're not going to investigate what's the origin of this arrow. Why is this arrow here? Who made this arrow? And then try to find out everything you possibly can and become an expert about the arrow.
Right.
Just to have more understanding about it.
Yeah.
The main concern is, I just need to pull this arrow out, right? Yeah. And that's the idea of just when you're present to the moment and you make that a practice. That's what that quote is kind of referring to. However, I think it depends. I think it really depends, because, for example, say you actually did interpret a past event differently, or you attempted to see how, let's say it's, again, back to it's like a bad relationship or something happened. Maybe you think about, what were they thinking? Why did they act the way they did?
Was it not personal, maybe?
Was it not personal? Was it also something that you did? Take some responsibility. Why does it have to be like it's the other person? Why can't I, for example, this is something that I think about all the time. Anytime I point a finger at someone, I will always think, where's my thing? Where's my version of whatever it is that I think they're doing?
Right.
So, if you if you think about how the other person might have been thinking and all that, maybe then you don't produce as many of thoughts about the past going forward. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily have to be this thing of practicing meditation, just being in the moment, not letting a thought grab your attention. It might be, hey, maybe deal with the thoughts you were having. You might not produce as many around that subject as well. So it depends. But there's other schools of thought as well. You might say it's all an illusion, right? All your thoughts are illusory, and right. And
definitely don't agree. Yeah, that's too extreme.
I'm just throwing out all these different schools of thought. There also might be another school of thought that says any thoughts that come to you sort of automatically, not from a place of intuition, just these ruminating automatic thoughts, that's not necessarily something that if you thought about it you would choose to produce. Therefore you can classify them as
System 1 and System 2.
There you go. Right. You might classify it as like you might see where somebody makes that argument about them being illusory, in a sense, because it's not necessarily something you would produce yourself. So that's interesting. And also, when I started to notice that there were thoughts that I would produce automatically, as opposed to thoughts coming from a place of brainstorming or critical thinking, or just, I just would stop to think about something. I noticed there was something, it felt strange. I was like, why are certain thoughts coming to me automatically? Why are they negative ones? What's going on over here with that? And then I would choose to ignore those thoughts as part of my own self-treatment, you can say.
And you know what I was thinking while you were saying all of that? That I think is the connection between the chemical imbalance and the thinking. So the way, my interpretation is the way that I think that psychiatrists are seeing is that the process is random, right? And it's like if we just get the medication, then you'll produce, kind of dopamine and serotonin. But so from my understanding, I think when people aren't able to believe these more positive things, right? So let's say you tell them something good, right? And so in terms of the cognitive distortion, so they use what's called disqualifying the positive. That doesn't count. So let's say my therapist says something really nice about me, right? That doesn't matter because I pay him, right? So for another person who doesn't, right? I've had that happen so many times. So if let's say, dude, I pay you, I'm like, oh God. So if you think about it in that way, right? So how can the brain produce, let's say, dopamine or serotonin, right? Which is connected to, let's say, achievement, right? A sense of gratification, right? Pretty much self-esteem, right? Unless it's kind of connected to some sort of carnal need, right? Unless you're just eating something really good and you're like, wow, this tastes good. But a lot of times dopamine and serotonin is produced because we feel good about ourselves, right? So if let's say one person interprets it as, wow, yo, that was like really nice, like wow, that's a nice compliment, and then you get this sort of rush in your brain that says, you're wonderful, right? So whereas the other person who doesn't produce as much dopamine and serotonin, for them, look, I don't know which one comes first, but it's certainly connected. So they're not able to take the interpretation that the therapist is putting out there. They're not able to say, my therapist thinks let's say I'm smart, or my therapist thinks I'm resilient, right? They think like, no, he doesn't think that way. He's bullshitting me, right? He's full of shit because I pay him, and this is what I expect to hear from him, and he knows that. So for that kind of person, right, who always finds a way around, right? So it's like they use these distortions, right, to kind of combat distortions. So if my distortion is I'm a failure, and then somebody tells me, hey, oh my God, no, you're not, you've like done all of these wonderful things, and then they're like, that doesn't count, and then they're disqualifying the positive. What they're doing is they're substituting one distortion for another. So if that's or rather they're maintaining one distortion with another. So if that's the case, then I can assume that they're not going to have any sort of chemical, they are going to have a chemical imbalance because their sort of thinking is all wrong. So interestingly enough, what I actually find, and I guess you can say this is what sort of I hesitate to use this term, the curative factor, sort of the mechanism that works, is when you're kind of able just to point out to people their various flaws and their accomplishments as well. So if you can give them a more nuanced understanding of who they are, they don't say, or they, again, hesitate to use this too, they don't tend, not always, but they don't tend to say like, oh, you're just feeding me positive bullshit. Because I'm like, no, I call you out too, right? So I tell you about the kind of shitty things that you do, but then on the other hand, I praise you for the good things that you do. So sometimes I find that alone kind of helps, obviously, the sort of chemicals balance out, whatever you want to call it. But it's so interesting, like when it comes to kind of medication and the environment and psychology, right? That a lot of times for us as people, and something that Jesse said, right? We hate hate complexity. We hate nuance, right? We prefer to essentially to view the world in these very simplistic terms and to kind of push away these problems. And so also, and not really a tangent, but I think connected, that a lot of times I think that when we don't want to think about other people's problems and when we don't want to empathize with them, it's very easy for us to say, yeah, let's just send them to the doctor. Let's send her to the doctor. I'd let the doctor figure it out. And I've had plenty of times, especially with kids, where parents will come to me and say, oh, I don't have no idea what's wrong with him. Like, just, you guys, you got to fix him. You, the psychiatrist, I don't know. I've tried all that I could. And then you kind of learn about the kid's life. You see the father's absent. The mother's verbally abusive. He doesn't get any sort of praise. The only time he gets any attention is when he messes up in some way.
The parents?
Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, of course he's...
You got to talk to the parents.
Yeah. And it's hard because the parents are like, I don't know. I don't get it. Like, there's something's wrong with his brain. And I'm like... Yes, but then no, right? So it's like, yes, he technically or she has a chemical imbalance, but it's not the whole story. That the chemical imbalance is it's a result of something, right? It's a result of obviously your genes, right? That kind of combine with your environment to obviously, I don't know, deactivate, I guess, or activate the depression genes. So the point is that it's not the whole story that there's a brain chemistry issue. And sort of like, yes, when the kid has low self-esteem and they're unwilling to accept compliments, they're never going to feel good. I mean, unless like, I don't know, they do something that's like, let's say, for just pure physical gratification purposes. So a lot of them overeat because they feel like the only time that they find joy in their lives is literally with food. Some of them obviously use drugs, right? Not obviously the kids, but like kind of the teenagers and the adults. Because for them, it's like the only way that I can kind of balance out my brain is with literally pure physical sort of, what are they called? Not toxins necessarily, but like pure pretty much physical,
Stimulants?
Yes! Thank you. Stimulants. There it is, right? So pure physical stimulants. Because I can't really do anything that'll make me feel good about myself because I'm going to explain it away as not mattering anyway. So the only thing that I could really use to feel good about myself is, let's say, literally sometimes drugs, sometimes food. So it's like when you would sometimes ask them, so here's an example, right? So I was seeing somebody who was like a heavy drug user, right? So this person is like, yeah, like I feel just really good using drugs, right? Like every time I'm on them, it's like, you know, I'm in this euphoric state. So then I would ask, okay, like when was the last time you felt a sense of accomplishment? And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, right, yeah, right. So I'm like, right. So if you think about it, right, people who do feel like they have a sense of self-efficacy, they don't really need the drugs, right? Because they have all of these other areas in their lives in their lives where they feel fulfilled. So they have, let's say, you know, kind of family where they feel important and they feel like they're a big part of their community. And then also on top of that, they have self-esteem and self-efficacy where they feel really important within that community and they feel like they've achieved within that community. So for that person, they're like, yeah, like, I don't know. I don't know what that's even like. I don't even remember the last time I accomplish something. So if we technically need, right, this sense of like this high or these dopamine rushes or whatever, serotonin rushes, then the idea is that if we're not going to get them in terms of our own self-esteem or self-efficacy, if we can't look in the mirror and say, you know what, I feel really good about myself, and boom, chemistry sort of pops up, right? If we can't do that, then of course we're going to find substitutes in food, drugs, you name it. So when there's no self-esteem, it's inevitable that you're going to find something else to make you feel better about it. And yeah, sometimes it's even the misuse of benzodiazepines.
Yeah, I mean, whoa, that's a lot to unpack there. I will say this. Okay, so for example, that patient that was, this is not just, with full respect to the patient, just with that myopic view of not being able to take a compliment.
Yeah.
And it's kind of in their own world, like they'll have a cognitive distortion, right. Not able to process the compliment. They'll think they'll just, you know, somehow do some mental jujitsu.
Yeah.
Just be like,
and boop.
Yeah,
doesn't
like,
matter.
Nope.
Uh-huh.
That's interesting because I think that's because if they actually embraced a totally different way of thinking about it, mm-hmm. that would mean letting go of their current belief system.
Yeah.
And to a lot of people, that's like, not consciously, but it's like synonymous with death or like an uncomfortable feeling of it's just purely uncomfortable. Right. Like people would rather hold on to their existing beliefs than try to embrace a new one and then feel this fear or just this loss of their current understanding of the world. They'd rather keep their current understanding.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed is if somebody is coming from I'm trying to pass judgment because here's the thing, like I've been there, you've been there, we've all been there, so it's not coming from this kind of place. But if somebody's coming from a low place, I try to meet them there at whatever level they're at, even if it's complaining. Like, I don't like to complain personally, but if somebody's complaining, I will meet them where they're at and probably find somewhere in me where I can genuinely complain with them. Or if they're very angry or something, I'll try to find that place in me that's as genuine as possible. Because here's the thing, I don't like to use this as a tactic. Because here's the thing, there is a thing of where if you meet someone at where they're at, in terms of their mental emotional state, they're more likely to listen to you and maybe take some kind of feedback from you because they feel understood.
Right.
But it depends because and it depends how genuine you are in that. If you use it as a tactic, it's not going to be effective.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be negative. I mean, tactics are in themselves not good or bad.
No, I hear you. It's just that people in general have bullshit detectors, and if anyone is really going through something serious,
Right.
then if you meet them where they're at genuinely, they're more likely to let their guard down.
Yeah.
Because maybe inherently they'll think whatever you're doing is bullshit. Unless it's as genuine as possible, they may disregard it and say, this person's just saying this to me, or whatever, and then they won't really connect.
You know what's interesting? I think you answered my question. So the one that I asked earlier, so the one of in terms of synaptic pruning, so is it difficult, or why is it difficult for more depressed people, let's say, to form kind of healthier beliefs, right, or to maintain them? So I think that actually makes sense. So if there's a part of them that's afraid, right, they're more anxious, or they prefer anxiety to depression, like I actually did. So like, okay, just as an FYI, when I was like, when I was a patient, right, when I saw a therapist, my therapist kind of called me out on this. So she's like, hey man, like it literally seems like you kind of use the fear of death, right, or rather, what was it that she said? She said that you kind of, you use sort of the fear of death to prevent yourself from living, right? So like you're hyper-focused on it and you're depressed, and she's like, it's kind of like you use your depression, right, to kind of, what did she say? That you use your depression to sort of, to stifle your anxiety, right? So it's like a part of you would rather be sad than scared. And I think maybe that's what I definitely know that.
Wow.
Yeah, she said that, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That was like one of the best revelations that ever happened to me, literally. So for her, right, yeah, so she's like, what you're doing, right, she's like, you're so pessimistic because when you're pessimistic, right, obviously you're sad, but then even like that's not the point, right, that's like a byproduct. But she's like, but when you are pessimistic, what happens is that you get to prevent yourself from trying. And she's like, if it's a failure anyway, why try, right, why be anxious? So if the anxiety is so debilitating for you, she's like, of course you're going to prefer the thing that's easier to tolerate. Not to say that she didn't say, hey Leon, you want to be depressed, right? That's not at all what she was saying. What she was saying is that you saw two evils, right? It's either I'm really, really anxious, right, and I probably fail because I already believe it, right, or I'm just really depressed and I don't even bother because I know I'm going to fail anyway, right? So she's like, you pretty much chose the latter because you saw the other one was too risky and too anxiety provoking, right? So I was like, wow, like this literally blew me away.
And it's like you're holding yourself at the time in one place so you don't have to take the next action, which is really scary. It's like holding on to your current existing...
Right. Yeah, and therefore you don't give yourself the chance to build up your self-efficacy. Therefore, you don't give your chance to your brain to produce dopamine and serotonin. So with you, what you just said, right, that made so much sense. Because if somebody, let's say, is holding on to their perception of themselves, right, that's what makes them feel safe. And we know as human beings, safety is pretty much the most important thing in our lives, right? Most of what we do is for safety, right? We want to survive. So if somebody, let's say, feels that let's say if I'm kind of scaring them, right, by pointing out these strengths that they have, it's like, oh no, like now that I have these strengths, I have to actually do something about it.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's much easier to hold back and sort of figure out these sort of cognitive loopholes, right, to get out of it, right? To say, no, you're wrong, no, I'm shit, no, I have nothing going for me. Because if I do have something going for me, now I have to actually build a life, and that is fucking terrifying. Because there's this other, still stronger part that says, no, you're worthless. There's no way this is going to work out. You're going to let yourself down, and you're going to let everybody down, right? And I think that we do that.
So then... do you think there's anything to then meeting whatever paradigm somebody's in currently, meeting them where they're at in order to kind of take them out of it little by little?
Yeah.
Because that for me, I'm not qualified to technically speak. A lot of books I've read, for example, of let's say 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, seek first to understand then to be understood. Anytime I've employed that in my own life, it does work. It is fantastic. It's basically that thing. Right. But would you think that if you tried, Maybe you do that already as a... Here's the thing.
Well, what's the question?
Wow, I'm so... Okay, well, what I want to say is, do you think that if you tried that, like, in sessions, where instead of, for example, you say something positive about the person, it's like, and it's that person who can't take the compliment or whatever, do you think it would be better to go into wherever they're at in terms of, let's say somebody who likes to complain, or somebody who's angry, or somebody who's depressed, maybe saying something from whatever their level of thinking is in order to then coax them out of it or something.
So, okay.
Or coax them out bit by bit, because you're not going to do that.
Instantly.
Yeah.
So what I try to do is then I focus on the fear, right? So if, let's say, somebody's depressed and they're like, hey, no, I feel like shit about myself, but I'm like, hey, no, these are the good things about you, but then they say, hey, no, they're not. So what I do is I try to sort of meet them where they are in terms of their anxiety, right? So a lot of times, like, people have these sort of, again, black and white thinking, right? So if I'm intelligent, if I'm beautiful, if I'm a great speaker, a great athlete, whatever it is, right? Sort of that means that I have to actualize my potential. So the expectation is, right, sort of if I'm all of these different things, right, that means I have to do something about it. So sometimes the thinking is I'd rather not be any of these things, right? Because what if I try and find out that I'm none of these things, right? Which is like, whoa, right? We pretty much do that. So the thing is, what I try to tell them is like, hey, let's look at all the evidence, right? So if the evidence says that you actually are all these things, but it's probably really scary for you to accept it, right? Because then you feel like you have to do something about it. But here's the thing, that even if you fail at this thing, right, that I'm telling you that you're supposed to be good at, right? So even if you fail in school, right, even if you fail as a writer, even if you fail as this, that, or the other, technically speaking, you can be all of these things while still failing, right? So that's the nuanced view. So if we're talking about, and I love this sort of growth mindset, fixed mindset, right? Fixed mindset says I'm all of these things, right, or I'm none of these things. Growth mindset says, no, I have this sort of innate potential that I need to develop. So what I try to focus on is that potential. Where if we're talking about, this is a hypothetical, right? Let's say a client of mine wants to be a writer, right? And they're like, well, my teachers told me I was a good writer, but I don't believe them, right? So obviously it doesn't make sense, because these are professors, right? They're pretty smart people. They're not going to lie to you. I mean, why, right? And you're already in school, you're studying this, etc. Right. So if that person doesn't feel like they're going to be a good writer because they can't accept, kind of those beliefs, and they say like, oh, well, he's just being nice to me, etc. So then, I focus on the anxiety. I say, okay, what is the fear? The fear is obviously a failure, right? And sort of the intensity of it, the intensity of like, whatever it is the anxiety is, or whatever it is of, right? In this case, obviously failure. So if that person is saying that I'm afraid of failing, right? If we can actually get them to admit that, then we talk about what failure actually means, right? Because for them, in the sort of generalized way of thinking, of a generalized way of seeing the world, failure means I am a failure, right? So it's like, if I'm a good writer, as they say they are, then technically I'm never supposed to get rejected. Technically I'm never supposed to have my work corrected. Technically I'm supposed to be published, right, many times, etc., right? They have all of these expectations for what it means to become a good, or be a good writer. Here's the problem, though. You can still be a good writer. You can still be intelligent. You can still be witty. You can still be articulate, right? And still be rejected by journals, and still have your work corrected, and still work on improving your writing. So what we focus on is that anxiety. So if the fear is of failure, right, we would start exploring what failure actually means. So do great writers always succeed, right? Do great writers always produce works of, let's say, magnificence? Do great writers feel like they aren't able to take feedback and that their work has to be perfect every single time? And the answer is no. Literally no to all of these questions. So if, let's say, you have this innate talent, if my compliment is you're intelligent, right? I've seen your work before. Your work is actually pretty good. And their interpretation is like, no, you're full of shit. And then I come back to, okay, or are you maybe afraid of failing, which is why it's so hard for you to accept this worldview? And then they say, yeah. And then we really explore what it actually means to be a good writer. And if we're focusing on, let's say, the growth mindset of that you have this potential that is never taken away from you, right? So let's say I know that you're intelligent, right? I know it because I know you. I know it because I've had conversations with you, right? And I do mean this personally too, obviously.
No. I'm smiling because you start to think that way.
Yeah.
But I know you're talking about somebody else currently.
Oh, he's talking. Yeah, but technically, yes.
No. It's a stupid little ego.
No, I hear you. So yeah. So then I would say, okay, so you're obviously intelligent. You're obviously all of these things. But here's the thing, right? The manifestations of them, right, are literally just manifestations. And if you feel,
I'm sorry, I hear the word manifestations, and I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay. So essentially, what they are, right, is that they're pretty much indicators of your potential, right? So okay. Here's this is a lot. So here's essentially what they would say, right? Well, what if my potential, right, isn't validated? right? That's always the fear, right? What if they tell me I'm a bad writer? My interpretation is they can be, right? So you've already had all of this feedback. It doesn't just disappear with the failure. So let's say hypothetically you given a writing assignment, right? You get a ton of feedback for it, and the person says like, these are all the things you can change, right? So then they could say, see, I told you, oh my God, I failed. I knew it. I knew I was a terrible writer. I was the worst writer ever, right? And then I would say that's impossible, because these teachers who've already given you the feedback saying that you are a great writer don't take away that feedback just because of this work, right? What this means, right? What I would ask them, what's a more likely interpretation? That they think you're a failure and that now they've changed their mind? Or is it that they think that you have all of this potential and they're using that potential, or they're using sort of their feedback to help, let's say, manifest your potential, right? Is that one or the other, right? So how is it possible that now all of a sudden they think that you're a terrible writer, right? Why would they even bother then? Because the thing is, if you really are a terrible writer and you don't have this, like, kind of whatever potential you have, nobody's going to focus on it. Nobody's going to waste their time on no potential. Like, it doesn't work that way. So if they thought that you were a failure, you would actually get the opposite result of what you expected. So now it's not that you wouldn't have got, or it's actually that you wouldn't have got all that feedback. You would have got no feedback. They would have just said, who cares, you're a failure.
Right.
So what I focus is on two things, right? Sort of your potential is always going to be there, right, based on the feedback that you've got, right? Sort of the world mirrored back to you what your qualities are. It's like that doesn't go away. And then when it comes to, let's say, the manifestation of it, right, succeeding on a test, like playing really good in some sort of game, whatever it is, right, those are just manifestations of talent that you already have, and that even if you screw up on, right, in terms of those events, you're still going to have that same talent, right? Even if you make mistakes, you're still going to have the same talent. So we try to focus more on intrinsic qualities rather than external outcomes. That's it.
What's interesting about that is, say what's related to the podcast.
Yeah.
When we first, actually I like the first episode, but did you notice that as we progressed through it, we had days when it was like really good in terms of how in line we were with our speaking or something like that, and days where it was not, or if it's like we're just starting to get guests or whatever, and then there's that whole new challenge. Not it's like a challenge, but you know what I'm saying? It's like a new thing to, so one thing that I noticed is when we were first going through that, even though I was fairly confident about my ability to speak, and maybe I had some things that were just kind of in the back of my mind that I can talk about as far as psychology is concerned and philosophy. What was interesting is that every time we were met with challenges, of course I took on the challenges anyway, and you can argue, I wouldn't call them failures, but I would say anytime where I wasn't, where I would judge that I was not at my best or something like that personally, just as my own critic, I would interpret that as like a failure, but it wouldn't stop me from continuing doing it. But to be completely frank and like just transparent about it, it's just like I definitely did experience like going backwards in my understanding of resistance, but so yes, but also like going backwards in my understanding of the world, because actually I felt like I started to question like, wait, am I actually like able to produce like good content in terms of like whatever I could speak about? Am I too in my head or something? Because as we're going through it, it just felt like there started to be more pressure with the show. But then I realized that pressure was kind of like pressure I was putting on myself. And but yeah, so for example, like if somebody's undertaking writing and they fail, it doesn't stop making them a writer or good at writing. So yeah, or in general, right? Also, I feel that way about the podcast. Like, just because maybe one time or another time I was not in line with my speaking or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean I can't speak or I can't remember certain things. So
you're more focused literally on your potential, right?
Yeah. For example, we had an episode. It was with. This is making me laugh already, with Gordon Marino, and we wrote off the denial of death, right?
Yeah, that's classic.
And here's the thing, I read the denial of death. There were things I used to just quote from it, left and right, right? I love Jason Silva, for example, who quotes denial of death all the time.
Yes.
And just, like, in that moment, you're like, Gordon, you read the denial of death? Alen read the denial of death. Alen, can you speak on that? And I was like, it's a good book, something like that. I don't remember what my response was.
It was
basically that.
Yeah.
And You know, I thought that was fine because we just went somewhere else with the conversation.
Yeah,
it's fine, ultimately.
Yeah, yes.
But if you think about it, I did. You know, that was one of those moments where I'm like, oh wow, I couldn't draw from memory for whatever reason.
Anxiety.
I don't know if I was
it's usually anxiety.
Fair enough. Okay, if you want to say it is, fair enough. I would say that I didn't feel anxious in that moment. I just felt like I couldn't recall.
Okay.
In terms of my own...
I hear you.
But if you want to say that from... I respect it.
Okay. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's too, like, a narrow...
You're like, no, you're anxious out.
Yeah, no, okay. I'm not that guy. I try not to be that
I'm just joking. You must
stop resisting!
No, but,
Accept my interpretation.
Exactly. But, yeah, so that was something where it's like, hey, we're undertaking something, and it's like, even if you fail, it's fine. Nothing to get... depressed about or to get low about. Just like try again.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like we went off on a tangent here actually a little bit.
No, it was close.
No. But then I started. I know, but
yeah, no, but I get your point.
I feel like we're distracting from the multiple ways of treating.
No, we're not. I actually disagree with you.
Yeah.
We're completely talking about that.
Fair
so
enough.
we're talking about the psychological. So for you, what you're saying is that so let's say somebody who is super depressed, right? Actually, they would have given up. So they would have looked at the outcome and they would have had that narrow view of, oh my God, this outcome proves that I'm terrible at this. Why am I going to bother anymore? Yeah.
So then to be fair, I've had times like that.
Yeah.
This was in the past. I was definitely able to unwire that side of myself.
Right.
And I think truly anyone is able to as well.
Yep.
And I really did have some crazy stuff going on in the background. Not just like internally, just with family and stuff like that. Like real life stuff. It's not. I mean, maybe one day I can get more into it, specifics. But for now, I'll just keep it general. But and over time, I was able to start to take action little by little. And then also, for example, if we never met, there would not be a podcast. I would be maybe still in the... I would still be attempting to try to do something with the Ego Ends Now page. And but here's the thing. Anytime I did, I would undertake something for like a good week or two. Go up, and then go back down,
right,
and then also I couldn't figure out like what I wanted to do with it exactly. I was starting to gain my own like momentum in terms of I had this side thing I would do on the side where I would be on camera, and I was practicing what that would be like. So this way I could be prepared to do something a little more structured for Ego, and I didn't want to do something improvised.
Yeah.
But then I realized that was me just being a perfectionist and not taking any action until I felt like I was fully able to. Until I had all the knowledge I needed and all of this and that, and I had such a structure. But yeah, if we never met, if I didn't in my attempts to go out and socialize and all that, which was part of the treatment of... So here's the thing. At the time we met, though, I was actually, I would say, fine. But I would say that it was one of the times where I was not... I was in a mode of working on stuff myself, like at home or something like that. Also, at the time, looking for work. So it was a period of me being in a lot. I didn't have so much money, resources to go out.
Right.
There was a time for that, and I used to go out all the time at one point. Then for a while I took a break from that, you can say.
Right.
So one of the times that we met was actually me coming out of that comfort zone. Because here's the thing, maybe at one time you can have been very social, but then if you go back into having a comfort zone, it has its own momentum.
Depression. See, that's what it was for me.
Yeah, so I don't know if it was depression, because I felt like I was actually moving up at the time by doing all these little activities and all that. So if I didn't try to get some momentum in terms of socializing, just in that one aspect, we never would have met. this wouldn't have occurred. And actually, forget even just that. Forget even the podcast. Actually, just a real moment right now. Also, yeah, like we've had a lot of laughs. Like sushi the other night, for example, with all the people without saying their names or whatever.
The homies.
With the homies, yeah. That was awesome. A lot of laughs. And like stuff like that is just awesome. So yeah, if I didn't try to push past these comfort zones or push through resistance, a lot of good things would not have happened.
Right. And
I'm very happy that I did. And I would recommend, like anyone at home, for example, if they're somewhere where let's say it's a really bad place. I'm not even saying like moderately or even mildly. Let's even say really bad. I would say, well, if it's actually severe depression, it would be good to meet with someone, like probably a therapist, actually.
I would say even a psychiatrist.
A psychiatrist, yeah. If it's like severe, if let's say you went to an actual therapist or a psychiatrist and they said that you have severe depression, actually, yes, seeing someone is a good idea, because if you're in such a low place like that, it's not easy to get out on your own.
Yeah.
And there may be a lot of different things besides your own internal beliefs and that keep you down. It could be environment. It could be people who are not supportive, or things like that. It could be people who don't believe in you and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Not everyone has such like bad circumstances, but a lot of people do. So of course it's going to be addressed.
Yeah.
But anyone with like, let's say mild or moderate, I would definitely say taking little baby step actions, one step above where you are currently. For example, if you're, let's say you haven't. So I had a period of time where I wasn't talking to a lot of my friends. I took a time to just kind of isolate myself and all that. So for me to get out of, let's say, that situation, what I would do is little by little, like once every few days or maybe once a week or something like that, I might message someone who's close to me or something like that, or as close as possible. Right. And then maybe a little more often, either with that person or with other people, kind of build it up. And that was just in terms of socializing. Right. This is such a complex and nuanced sort of a thing that it is such a case specific thing. I don't want to be so general. Could be if somebody's very if somebody is agoraphobic, for instance, and they don't want to go outside, maybe attempt to go outside for a second and then right back inside.
Yeah.
Go outside for 3 seconds next time. Go right back inside. Right. And like really be very gentle with yourself in terms of where you are with it. If you even failed, it's fine. You made an attempt. Right. Then you try again. Maybe you don't try again for a few weeks for whatever reason. You think that's even more of a failure and it holds you down more. Maybe not necessarily. Maybe that's just a part of the process, and then you try again, and then you build more momentum. And again, why did I use agoraphobia? I don't know actually. I could have used other examples, right? You know what I'm saying?
I do. I get it.
Like there's, as a general thing, I would say.
I thought you were gonna say, why did I use agoraphobia? Here's this really great detailed explanation. I don't know.
I don't know why. No, I would definitely say if wherever someone's at, to baby step their way from that area.
Right.
Try to, again, look up good sources on the internet, different podcasts. I don't know, Sam Harris is good. That's one example.
I love that podcast.
Yeah.
What is it called? Waking Up, right?
Waking Up with
Sam Harris, yeah.
That's one example. There's I like Joe Rogan. I like a lot of different podcasts. It depends. It depends on what you resonate with. Actually, I would recommend someone to find somebody they resonate with, who they would consider to be a role model from their perspective, and then attempt to listen to them.
Yeah.
Little by little.
And role models are super important. So a lot of times when people don't have them, obviously, they don't, know how to sort of behave and how to act. And then plus they don't have the sufficient self-esteem because those role models who are non-existent were never there to tell them how great they were. Or even, both, right? Tell them how great they were and then obviously point out the things that they should correct. So it's like they don't have a map or a blueprint of themselves and the way that they should go about living.
What would you recommend to somebody who doesn't want to have a role model or a mentor? I've met actually a lot of people like that who are like, I don't need like someone to teach me or
yeah, you do.
no
Yeah.
But say they have that thought for whatever, even if they didn't fully think about it and think that, but I was molded by my environment, so there were plenty of role models.
Yes.
But then maybe they don't
Okay.
get there. What would you say to somebody who has a resistance to having a mentor or listening to like some kind of...
I would say point out one person in the entire universe that has ever, through their own sheer will and determination, build up their self and self-esteem.
Without anyone.
Without anyone. I'd love to see this person. Please bring him, show me anyone, and I would love to see it. It doesn't work that way. We don't exist in vacuums. So everything that was done to us is in some way, let's say before we're able to, or when we were, let's say not willing to, I don't know, whatever. That's a distinction I'm not going to go into because it's way too philosophical. But the point is that when it comes to self-esteem and when it comes to kind of like sort of being who you... No, wow, I've lost the thought. Oh, that sucks. When we talk mentors, right? When it comes to... so the vacuum, right? So when it comes to sort of existing or non-existing... Rather, no.
Well, Jamie talked about it too when she had a response to
the David Brooks thing, right? Yeah. So I think what I wanted to say was that in terms of being in a vacuum, that technically nobody exists in a vacuum, right? So right now I remember. So when it comes to things happening to us, right? Essentially before, or like I said, philosophically, I don't know, before we're actually like we're able to or willing or some combination of the two to critically think, that what happens is essentially that the environment affects us, right? We're pretty much sponges, right? We sort of take in what the environment tells us about us, and we take in what the environment tells us about the world. So, and we just react. That's it. We're just pure, like, kind of kids, right? Kids just react. They don't think about it. They react in terms of how they see themselves. They react in terms of how they see the world. They react in terms of their behaviors. It's pretty much stimulus response, right? Until you sort of get the ability to sort of think for yourself. So, when it comes to that, right, if you're talking about not ever having mentors, or let's say coming from an abusive environment, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. How can a kid without any sort of mentor learn how to take care of him or herself? How is that even possible? How? I don't know.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Where do you have any other thought? Not to do that to you, but do you have any other thoughts about like maybe the article that we?
Yeah, I was actually just gonna go to the last one. So because we're pretty much out of time. All right. So this is the last statement not the last statement in the article, but one of the most important ones that we have. So Hari says everyone knows that human beings have innate physical needs for food, water, shelter, clean air. There is equally, let's say, clear evidence that human beings have innate psychological needs to belong, to have meaning and purpose in our lives, to feel like we are valued, to feel we have a secure future. Our culture is getting less good at meeting those underlying needs for a large number of people, and this is one of the key drivers of the current epidemic of despair. So I love that quote, and I think it pretty much encompasses our entire episode. That what we're sort of focusing on is obviously, in addition to the biological and biochemical troubles in somebody's mind or brain, is that we're focused on the psychological needs that they're missing. And by the way, one of them is having a mentor.
Yeah. Honestly, that's fantastic, because especially if you have a role model, and it doesn't have to be somebody near you. That's why I mentioned like having somebody in a podcast, for instance.
Right.
That's why I love the internet, because the chances are that the chances that you'll find someone who can act as a role model and that you resonate with, considering the vast expanse of people and resources that are available online.
Yeah.
It's so much easier now, in my opinion, than any time before to actually not just fix just depression or just treat depression, to just live a very healthy, nice, balanced life, potentially.
Yeah.
And then also, if somebody's in a environment that doesn't allow for that, maybe from an economic perspective, there are still resources for you to be able to pull yourself out of that as well.
Even though, just FYI, I would argue that's still with a role model. Even if you're reading books, even if you're reading literature online, all of these, somebody wrote it.
I'm saying that as well. I'm not saying so you can find that out from a role model as well online. It's just that I would agree that it's very hard to, for example, like say there's somebody you like who says who talks about just mentally how to control your emotions, thoughts, feelings, and all that.
Yep.
But then, how does that help you in terms of earning a living? But except in terms of when you're relating to other people in attempting to earn a living.
Yeah.
But there may be other things that are missing from that kind of role model. Mm-hmm. You may need someone who speaks specifically about something economically related, or how to get a job, or how to do an interview, how to do resumes and things like that. Just very simple things. Because here's the thing: somebody can become very centered. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily enlightened. We could say enlightened, sure, mm-hmm. but very centered. But it doesn't mean that you automatically, once you become really centered or enlightened, that you get certain skills that you need in order to survive/thrive in the world. Mm-hmm. And so, it would be important to have a healthy balance of sources where you get your information from.
I hear you.
Yeah. Unless somebody is in such a depressed place where, and it's a very mental sort of challenge that they're experiencing, mm-hmm. then yes, deal with only the people speaking about what's going on internally. Yeah. So it depends, because in the article they did address economics dealing with maybe being an aspect of depression as well.
Yeah, it's a societal, right? So social, the way you think. Oh, and by the way, and this isn't something that we obviously didn't have time to get into, but so in terms of the economic, right? So the economic, as I'm sure you know, can obviously affect the way you see yourself. So like when I was a kid and I was fucking poor, my interpretation was that I am fucking worthless, right? So I am poor and I'll never be anything else. So obviously the pessimism stemmed from my environment. So it's all connected. That's the point. And no, I never took an antidepressant, so I don't know. But I'm assuming that if I still went back into that environment, I would have still felt like shit. Yeah. So, yeah. I know, right at the end. I'm like, oh, here's this bombshell.
No. I mean, but what's great is that since we have addressed that there are these multiple ways to treat depression, it's important to highlight that there's never just one way to deal with it, and there's a balance. Yeah. And when you realize that there's a balance, that actually gives a lot of hope mm-hmm. to the hopeless. Yeah. Because some people before maybe this podcast, or just in general, maybe with their current thoughts and beliefs, maybe they thought it was just one way to deal with it. Maybe they really did think, oh, I can only deal with this chemically. Oh, I can only deal with this socially. Yeah. Oh, I can only deal with this economically. Yeah. And that's good to know, because then it at least opens up someone to consider other perspectives, and it could potentially change a life that otherwise would have looked at things a little more black and white.
Yeah, and I can tell you from personal experience that you can even no longer be poor and still consider yourself as poor. So that's the psychological for you.
Yeah, mm-hmm. and there you go. So it's important, and so it's a journey. And but one thing that's actually, I would like to leave it with this. Mm-hmm. Back to that baby stepping idea. If you use these ideas, or some of the other ideas that we talk about in the podcast, and you are somewhere, if you move forward to a place that is ahead of where you were before. Mm-hmm. That progress is tremendous. It really is it's a big deal. Even if you're 0.1% better today than mm-hmm. you were yesterday. Yeah. Think about how that would stack as days go on if you kept that sort of rate of growth. Yes. That eventually, a year later, and I understand for some people they want the change right away, and I understand a lot of also products and like self-help products and all that market things is like, transformation now, you'll be transformed with this, even if they say it's a 6-day thing or a week product or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's much longer than would otherwise reveal, at least in the marketing aspect. I'm not saying they're hokey.
Yeah,
maybe they do address that in the actual product, but in the marketing of it, it's not that quick. It's just to grab your attention.
But you can also be, like, in terms of long-term achievements, be proud of the short-term achievements that you have too.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. There's a lot.
Here's the thing. Yeah, I felt like I could speak.
There's a lot.
I think we're getting to a level where I think we could even, if we wanted to, do 2 hours and arguably even 3 hours. But we're, just in the interest of time.
Yeah.
I guess we'll stop it here, right?
Yeah. You're like, should we go on?
No, we should.
No, it's already.
Right? Aren't we like an hour and 20?
Yeah. It's pretty. We could do a follow-up episode to this.
That's true.
Yeah, well, I don't want to do that because I think the follow-up episode could be good too.
That works.
All right, cool.
All right then, guys. Remember to guys and girls. Remember to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. We're also on Google Play and iTunes and wherever you can find podcasts. Working on getting it everywhere, but that's neither here nor there. Also remember to subscribe.
Hit the bell.
And we will see you next time with a very special guest.